maybe I need to turn to Sam for some advice on this, or maybe Mark Brown is here, but in the situations I'm familiar with, it controls discharges to the area of special biological significance. So it's not been an area where you've got, if a tributary that was well upstream and you were discharging to that area, in the situations I'm familiar with, I don't think they would have been influenced.
I think that's correct.
No.
I think that's correct, and there's some good
scientific reasons for that. The effects of stormwater are greatest near where the discharge occurs. So in the vicinity of where a pipeline is discharging into a water body, that's where you have the greatest impact, particularly for things like pesticides. So, and some of the recent research that's been done on some of the storm drains in the Sacramento area and in the lower American River show that that's the case. So you get a lot of benefit from protecting and restricting or prohibiting direct discharges into those areas. So that's what our thinking was when we were putting this together. So we were thinking more the nearby or direct discharges where there's actually a pipeline going into, or a stormwater dominated water body going into one of these areas.
And Sam, with that then, so you, in order to, if you have permitted discharges right now, so restricting or prohibiting, you talk about new, but if folks come in for whatever permits that would go to the state water board, if that's where it lies, does it require retrofitting of all these systems? Because a lot of systems, they're not, you have dual systems, as I understand it, in a lot of municipalities where stormwater, it may have some filtration, but it typically is not treated. So if you're talking about a whole new treatment regimen, that's more than a little cost. That's a big cost, because you got to be able to accept the volumes. I mean, we have stormwater retention basins that pull off, some of the constituents that's built into development patterns. Again, where I'm familiar with, certainly in Sacramento County, but where you're able to do that, and then you have to monitor the sediments and such in those. But if you're talking about having to, beyond doing some of those types of strategies, actually have a treatment at the head end to your tributary, where it's the American River or Sacramento River area. I mean, those are order of magnitude of, tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in costs. If you're talking about existing development. Now, if you're talking about new, well, there's been, you had 150 years of development, so I don't know what you capture by doing so much of the new, except putting a whole lot of that expense to incrementally to those systems. So I'm trying to get some sense about how this would get implemented from at least past tense of what people dealt with this.
I think it would be helpful to look at what's been done with the rules for areas of special biological significance, and they have taken into consideration existing discharges. And I think the regional boards and the state board generally have to consider cost in their decisions, and have taken a pretty balanced view of that, and have considered the cost issues and the impact on the communities. So.
And is it fair then, I guess in the eye of the beholder, but so a restoration opportunity area to be equivalent to an area of special biological significance? I mean, I would think those are, you may move from that category over to here, but those aren't one and the same as I understand them. At least even the language that points them out here. That's a pretty big move to go from special biological significance. You have a restoration opportunity area that has a reason why it may be designated as such, but
I think we used that as an example, and I think the specifics of what would be done and how that would be protected is something that we would leave to the water boards to take up. But I think that's a good point.
Okay. Just one other point here. I don't probe the detail too much, but I appreciate the background. It was very interesting. But I think that one of the things that was a little irony in all this is that, having sat through the commission's discussion about water quality and certain beneficial uses of a variety of sorts, obviously was focused on agriculture and certainly on the economic viability and sustainability of communities in Delta. But in large part, what's being talked about here, the brunt of it would be borne by the Delta communities, or those that are certainly adjacent to. if not immediately in the delta, are the ones that are going to, would bear the, including, if I understand this right, with agricultural runoff, which obviously already has some standards associated with it and so forth, but where those islands, for example, that are adjacent, they're pumping year round to keep water off that, and it comes from their drainage ditches and so forth, and some of that, may or may not be under any, monitoring regime, but that concerns me is that, the whole idea was that water quality is important to everyone and to all these uses. On the other hand, in large part, the not just the expense, but the ongoing burden, depending upon which policy choice is made here and or future regulatory actions, that gets borne by the folks who may get some benefit, but there's a whole lot of other folks that benefit that wouldn't be paying for that necessarily. Is that fair? Or, I mean, if I'm wrong, tell me. I'm just trying to get some sense as I'm thinking this thing through.
I could see, that point of view. I think in our looking at it, we were trying to make sure we had a balanced. We thought this was would be a balanced approach. I think, Sam's pointed out, we've got a lot of confidence in the water board's demeanor on these things. They've been pretty thoughtful about making sure they're thinking about the economy as well as the environment. As these areas are restored, there are going to be, tens of millions of dollars invested in them. And so making sure that part of that investment is in water quality so that the aquatic systems we're trying to rebuild are successful, so that the species we're trying to recover can thrive. That's part of that package, and yeah, everybody, we've all recognized none of what we're trying to do in the Delta is going to be free, and there's going to be costs that fall on people.
I did want to point out that some of these actions that might be taken may not be terribly expensive. In at least one case, we worked with Contra Costa Water District to relocate some agricultural drains that were impacting their water supply. And that's a fairly cost-effective thing to do. They had an intake, a drain going right into an intake practically, and moved a drain from one side of the island to another. In another case, they put a diffuser on it to diffuse the discharge so that it didn't impact their water supply. And it was very cost-effective and achieved the goals of the program in protecting that source of water. So some of these solutions may be very, very cost-effective and fairly simple.
Just final comment. Some examples like that would be useful to know. Again, going off the text that you provided, which again I found interesting and helpful in thinking this thing through, but of some of the implementation measures that may be lower cost but still allow for for better compatibility and to meet a multitude of goals in a way that doesn't overly burden one region, the one we're still trying to protect, versus others that even regionally within a county or within a municipality and so forth. So again, if you have some other examples like that, it'd be useful, or give me the reference material. I'll read it myself. So, thanks,
Mr. Fiorini.
This came about because I believe staff felt that there needed to be a policy in the water quality chapter. It seemed like it's such an important issue, and that chapter in the fifth draft didn't have a policy, so we need to have a policy. And it was suggested at the last meeting that there is a need to encourage the state board and the regional boards to do something to avoid any gaps in water quality. But you haven't compelled me to believe that there are any gaps. Every municipality, every agency that I've ever heard from, when they refer to the regulations and the oversight of a regional board, would suggest that they've gone too far already, and that they haven't missed anything, that they're working really hard to tighten things up. I, for one, think that we ought to state that we're in favor of good water quality and that we're not in favor of selective pollution. And when you talk about protecting specific areas, it would suggest that water quality standards are higher for a restoration area than they may be downstream, and that's not a good message to send. So I, for one, am either in favor of not including this policy as presented, or I like your sub-goal. I like option 4 because it states what I think we need to state is that we're in favor of water quality and we want to encourage good water quality. We want to encourage the regional boards to do everything they can to ensure that if, as an example, stormwater releases are a problem, that stormwater releases be dealt with in broader delta and not selectively just because there's a restoration area. It needs to be broader than that.
Sure. And Councilmember Fiorini, I think maybe what gets lost is this focus on the concern about redundancy. I think some of the most valuable parts of the proposed policy are those parts where it says we're just asking folks with projects to identify ahead of time what the potential water quality impacts are. And once that's out there, both they and the water boards can move ahead with more information. We're simply saying that within the Delta, we are asking that for projects, that these projects identify the potential water quality impacts. That probably has more value than the rest of the policy statement there in terms of getting all this stuff out, getting things identified, and getting things fixed, even before the project's proposed. Because that puts everybody in a position to understand what's the cost of my project before I even start. So I think that was the concern, and a lot of the motivation for this policy was to just get folks to identify what their water quality impacts are. In terms of stormwater and the gaps, the stormwater program is operated largely, as was mentioned, on BMPs. It's not a perfect way. There's a lot of stormwater. It's the most cost-efficient way. But we can do better than that. And when we have specific projects, particularly some stormwater projects, there may be a better way to dive into that issue than to just say, just handle it like stormwater like every other community throughout the entire state of California. That we could do a little bit better with specifically stormwater within the Delta, because it's largely BMPs. We don't have a lot of good effluent limit requirements on those like we do most normal dischargers. And in terms of Mr. Natoli's comments earlier regarding the discharges from ag lands, the default is you cannot discharge pollutants unless you have an NPDES permit that allows you to do so. So that's kind of the default. And the stormwater permits do that. What we could do is have a more clear, in this case, understanding of what it is with regard to that permit and with regard to the water board's issue. The water boards are always going to have to do a reasonable potential analysis in setting effluent limits. They're always going to have to look at what's reasonable, what could happen from this facility, and try to set requirements based on that. So this is just to identify up front what's going on, let the discharger and the water board know what the cost is going to be to get that squared away. And then move ahead with something in a real public forum.
Felicia?
Actually, that's helpful, but still not. I'm still having trouble figuring out exactly what it is we're trying to do here that doesn't just duplicate what the water boards may be doing anyway. So just bear with me as I try to figure out what you have in mind. Because as I look at this language, it just seemed really broad and vague. It wasn't locationally specific, and the concern that people raised was, I'm thinking about Ms. Dorn, they have to go through so much permitting anyway, and they've got the water boards looking over their shoulder. Why do they have to file one more piece of paper to a group that isn't the same level of expertise? I heard that. On the other hand, I also heard if through all of these months of hearings, water users in particular have talked about other stressors than flow. Well, to deal with that, you've got to improve habitat. The habitat we're improving in special places, not the entire Delta, needs to be created and protected, and we need to hit other stressors. So I've also heard that it's really important for a variety of reasons that we deal with these other stressors, but in a targeted, everything in a targeted way rather than an across-the-board way. So I'm open to the idea that we need to do something that oomps up the water quality point with little arrows saying, like here, this would be a good place. So I'm looking at all these options and figuring out how you could pull them together. And then the question I have is, in looking at it is, if TMDLs are happening, and I don't know exactly where they're happening when or the status of that, then in theory, the regional boards are pointing out all the beneficial uses, which would include, I would think, ecosystem restoration. And so the TMDL process should be taking care of this, except that we're talking about a process that we haven't yet defined well enough of using adaptive management in experimenting and then evolving. So the ecosystem restoration process that we may go through over the course of the next number of years, if we ever get this articulated well, of trial and error, means these locations may also be changing at a pace that maybe outstrips what the board can do. So maybe we should be, then we go back to your map up here, sort of the broadly stated kind of big areas we've targeted. And the question, well, maybe that's too big of a target because it's going to take in too many people. So I'm trying to figure out what is the kind of lightest touch, pay attention to this issue, policy or recommendation that gives us the hook in case there's something really bad that's coming up that no one else is paying attention to.
Let me start out, and then I'll turn it over. Let me
here.
start out, and I'll turn it over to Sam. So, I probably, put our foot in this a little bit in thinking that we could deal with it as simply as it's been dealt with in the Bay Area on the coast, with a very simple policy. Mm-hmm. And so, again, the policy that we've proposed is quite like the ones that are operating the Bay Plan on the coastal plan. Okay. And the way those have worked has been pretty straightforward in that if the water board takes an action that says this is good enough, the coastal commission says, yeah, okay, we'll live with that. But in those areas where the water board hasn't had authority, a policy like this has allowed local governments and the coastal commission on appeal to act on things that were egregiously obvious. I think let Sam talk a little bit then about in terms of the approach of identifying particular areas, the restoration opportunity areas, for about how the water board has dealt with areas of high biological productivity in the water quality plan.
I do. Well, I think the one area that the water boards don't have a great deal of authority on is directing people where to discharge, and I think that's an element here, and probably one of the main issues where we think this adds something. So, the water boards didn't tell the reclamation district to move their drain from one side of the island to the other. They don't do that. They just say, here's the limit, you meet it. So that's kind of the gap we were getting at in the recommendation side of this. And I think that was, I don't know if this helps, but that was when we started thinking about this broader water quality policy, that's where our kind of thinking got to as far as where is there a gap that we can really identify and show where this might take place. I think the broader policy that's been proposed would probably catch that, and maybe a few other things, but I don't know if that helps. That's kind of where we got to the recommendation side of this.
Could you combine the two?
I think our thinking was it would be you could combine them.
I mean, so you would be limiting the policy to a few areas as opposed to every discharger in this vast swath, or every new facility proposed having to go through the exercise. You could say, get this policy once we have it, then those would come to us. I'm not saying that's what, I want to hear what everybody has to say. I don't know what the right answer is here. I think the instinct to try and be protective of water quality in certain places and not having a loophole or a missed opportunity is consistent with what we've heard from people across the spectrum everywhere. So I'm open to coming up with something, but I think whatever we do, particularly in a regulatory arena, should be, remember, conservative in regulation and bold in recommendation. So I'm trying to figure out how you pull those together.
Yeah, I think the other thought I had on this is that I know folks think that the stormwater regulations are strong enough and put a lot of requirements, a lot of burden on the local community, and they do. It takes some effort to deal with, but it's also true that even though those programs have been in place for a number of years now, there's still some significant water quality issues associated with storm drainage, particularly pesticides and some heavy metals. And if there are things that can be done in a cost-effective way to prevent, an impact, especially in some of these areas where we are talking about investing a great deal of money in restoration. I think that we ought to have the ability to push people in that direction.
Yeah, I think, how do you, why doesn't the TMDL process address it?
I think if it could eventually, it's a long process, and I think especially with everything regarded to pesticides, they're working in that direction, but it takes time. And one of the difficult things with pesticides is that new ones come up all the time. Is one issue, but it's also especially in the valley, it's that balance between the need for the use of pesticides and keeping them where you're trying to use them. And so it seems like that ought to be the way it's done, but in the real world, it's a much more challenging thing to have to deal with.
I wonder too, and maybe, I don't know the answer, so I'll ask you, but I wonder if part of the difference too is in the scale at which that water quality protection is done. TMDL, my recollection, the ones I've seen, and I did spend some time on the Mercury one, and I worked on TMDLs on the Mississippi as well. They're done on relatively large scales.
Right.
You're looking at all of Cache Creek or all of the Sacramento Valley in terms of the mercury and methylmercury one, where protection that focused on specific, relatively local areas such as Sassoon Marsh or such as the Cache Slough area would allow you to have much more careful protection than you would be able to get through TMDL, which was maybe done on a much larger scale in terms of allocating the load. Would that be reasonable?
I think that's true. Yeah.
Can I ask one more question? Is that okay, just so that I
Yes.
understand this? And this goes back to something Mark said, just so that I understand what you meant. Again, I wasn't totally clear on what we were asking people to do here and what the hook would be in the policy. And you said something about, you thought it was just to have people identify things. So are you saying, does it mean that people need to identify potential things, but we wouldn't be taking on the authority to make them do anything? We're just saying that they have to identify them?
On the left-hand side of the matrix, second paragraph of the proposed staff original option is what they're saying, to avoid or shall avoid or mitigate those impacts to the maximum extent practicable. The next sentence describes the language that would be applied.
Right.
This would be applied, Mr. Stevens, correct me if I'm wrong, for a covered action as defined by law that comes to the council with the local agency saying it's a covered action. And this would be one of the information provisions required, and they would have to meet the standard of providing that information.
Additional thing they need to identify from folks who already
Yep.
have to identify
Yep.
under
Yep.
the...
Yeah, typically they would be, you'd be projects, almost any project that's going to be a covered action is going to have an environmental document that goes with it. They're going to have to include in that information that would look at impacts to water quality, and then they would be able to show they were in compliance with this policy by showing that they could meet the regional board standards or had a wastewater discharge or other water quality permit from the water
So in
board.
some ways, what you're trying to get at with this policy is just shining a light on the water quality.
Yeah, and where there was no water, in the way this is drafted,
Yeah.
if the way you can show, one of the ways you can show compliance is showing that, hey, you've met the water board's regulatory requirements, then that's the get out of jail card. If there are no water board regulatory requirements, then you've really got to be able to show
That you've
that
done something
you've
else.
done something.
Sorry,
Randy.
thank you.
Randy.
I recall at our November meeting, we had a representative from the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board come and talk to us about pyrethroids. And their approach to controlling the discharge of pyrethroids into the waterways was to address it at the very heart, the very point.
At the source.
They were restricting structural pest control usage of pyrethroids, and they were instituting a number of limits. And they presented that to us as an example of the kinds of actions that they're taking to reduce pollution. Now, that's why I think that there's adequate controls in place and the ability to deal with these kinds of things. And I would rather see our emphasis placed on identifying what the pollutant is that we're trying to reduce or eliminate and deal with it at that point, and not just talk about where the wastewater discharge should be here or there. So That's why I think this policy misses the mark.
Of course, the Central Valley Water Board they can't regulate pesticide application. They can regulate its discharge. So they would be working with the Department of Pesticide Regulation and local counties to talk about that, and municipalities to talk about that. They don't have control over those folks. They cannot dictate what they'll do. They'll provide comments, and those folks will make their own decisions, and that's good. But the Water Board doesn't have that direct control over those issues that are happening before it hits the water. They can exercise some through their municipal stormwater permits, but that's limited.
That's contrary to the report we received in November.
Well, I certainly don't want to contradict the Regional Water Board.
They were in conjunction with others, but they had developed a policy that's enforceable to regulate the way structural pest control applicators utilize pyrethroids to reduce pollution.
I'm guessing that must have been through their municipal stormwater permit, because they do have some authority there. It's not perfect, and it's difficult to monitor.
I think that was...
Let me weigh in just for a minute on this. The Delta policy under our statute reads as follows on this specific issue. Policy of the state of California is to achieve the following objectives that the legislature declares are inherent in the co-equal goals for management of the Delta. And the fifth in the list is improve water quality to protect human health and the environment, consistent with achieving water quality objectives in the Delta. And this discussion and debate is less, in my judgment, about, should we do it as a regulation or not a regulation. It raises all the questions of upstream and downstream users that have plagued human history. And the reason why there's all this commotion, and Don stated it very clearly, is if you think that a person who causes an environmental damage should pay for the cause, everybody seems to think that's true of people upstream, but if it turns out that we are causing the problem, well, gosh, that's going to cost a lot of money. That discussion permeates everything. It's part of the water flow standard and everything else. But the reality is this links also very clearly with the export of water. One thing is very clear in the Delta. Export of water from the Delta is not a pollutant. What it does is it reduces the supply of water in the Delta that the people who are polluting says dilutes their pollution so that they don't have to do anything about it. That's kind of the practical argument. The old slogan, the solution to pollution is dilution, is one of the reasons why people who advocate that like to keep flows as large as possible so their obligation is as little as possible. The fight over the Sacramento Regional Sanitation Plant has much of that element about it. But really, it's also the objections to setting Delta flow standards whether for water quality by the Water Board or anything else. And so it's hard to imagine a future in California where the water supply is relatively static, the demands are increasing, and we don't acknowledge upfront clearly and obviously that the water quality requirements are increasingly important for everyone. Folks down south, you may say, well, they shouldn't take any water from up here, but for 50 plus years that has been happening, and they are acutely conscious of the need to have, in their view, minimum exposure of cost because of the quality of water being deteriorated by prior use. That's the same argument we made in Sacramento when we sued the gold miners in the 1880s saying you're destroying our river. And the hydraulic mines were put out of operation by the courts of California because you cannot use water in a way that is fundamentally damaging to other users. You just can't do it. That's not legal. And so I look at that. So walk back from that grand and grandiose argument, which everyone says, oh, it's going to cost a lot of money, you can't charge me any money. That's what's going to happen in the future anyway. When population increases to 50 million people and more businesses and all that, of course the water quality is going to become affected by the frequency of use, and we're going to be involved in this discussion for generations. This says when a covered action under law comes before the council, the entity with the covered action should provide information regarding water quality in the delta. And that's the other thing that's really disturbing. A lot of the debate around here has been, particularly from upstream users, as if the Sacramento River is not one river, as if the water uses of upstream have nothing to do with the water uses downstream. And all this could be solved if the legislature had written a bill that said water quality in the delta is of secondary importance. They did not. They did not. And that's, to me, that's what this is about. So I look at it and I say, is it really broad and powerful? This doesn't meet the requirement of some of the environmental groups who want us to adopt our own standards and order everybody to start doing things immediately. We don't have that power. This is very narrowly drawn, very specifically focused to say that water quality is a big deal and they ought to make this presentation as part of a covered action application. So that's me. That's all I see. Yeah. Okay, Joe.
I'm going to try and propose something here because I am concerned that we're regulating a problem that doesn't exist, and I want to be careful about that. But I do think that it's important that we say that water quality is a fundamental value. So what I'm going to recommend at the moment, and obviously I can be talked out of this, is that we make the policy one that just says proposed actions, so that's covered action, shall identify any significant negative water quality impacts, and just say period. The thing that with the way it's worded now, and shall avoid or mitigate those impacts to the maximum extent practicable, might put the council in a position of trying to make decisions about how you mitigate things that we can always comment on through the EIR process, and is something that people have to do as part of doing an EIR in any event. And I'm not sure that there's a problem, and I don't want to go looking for a problem and invent one to regulate. I do think it's important that people disclose their impacts if they're going to do that, and I don't think that's different than existing law. And we have in many cases been citing existing law and other policies in the plan. I also think adding a sub-goal is a very important thing for the council. And then we ought to really actually study, come to understand if this is a problem. Because as I said, I know that there are obviously water quality problems in the Delta, but I'm not sure how many of them are actually caused by covered actions. I think most of what we have are legacy. And we don't have authority over all those legacy issues, and it might be more useful if we say we have this sub-goal that we want to attain, and we're going to look at what all these legacy issues are and how we can help change things.
Can you also put that into your things we'll look at next?
Exactly. So we add that, and so because having been on the regulated side, there is a lot of regulation. There is a lot of regulation, and it is expensive. That doesn't change the fact that we need to make sure that people really disclose what they're doing, and we want to be able to have a hook to make sure that they do that. So I think having that as a policy is appropriate. So that's I'm proposing that as a compromise here. Is that
let's